The winter of 1962 was the coldest I'd ever known. I was 28 then, newly appointed as the assistant lighthouse keeper at Ravens Point. The position had opened suddenly after the mysterious disappearance of James Morton, the previous assistant. The head keeper, Harold Pierce, had been alone for 3 weeks when I arrived. I remember the drive along the coastal road, my old Ford struggling against the bitter wind. The lighthouse stood like a bone, white sentinel against the steel, gray sky, perched atop black cliffs that plunged straight into the churning Atlantic. Even from a distance, something about its solitary silhouette made my skin crawl. "The road ends here, children," I said, stoking the fire. From there, it was a quarter-mile walk along a narrow path to the lighthouse itself. The waves crashed hundreds of feet below, sending spray so high it would soak you to the skin. Harold Pierce met me at the door. He was a tall man, gaunt as a scarecrow, with deep-set eyes that seemed to have seen too much. His handshake was firm but ice-cold, and he didn't smile when he welcomed me. "You'll learn the routines quickly enough," he said, leading me up the spiral staircase. "Keep the light burning, monitor the radio, log the weather. Simple tasks, but vital. One mistake could mean death for the ships out there." The lighthouse interior was immaculate, almost obsessively so. Every brass fitting gleamed, every surface dust-free. But there was something off about the place, a heaviness in the air, like the pressure before a storm. "What happened to Morton?" I asked as we reached the watch room. The agency wasn't very clear about his departure. Pierce's face tightened. "Went mad," he said shortly. "Started talking nonsense about voices in the fog, faces in the waves. One morning, his bed was empty. Never found a trace." He must have seen the concern on my face because he added, "Isolation does strange things to people, son. Some aren't cut out for it. Now, let me show you the light." The great Fresnel lens was a marvel of prismatic glass and brass, rotating slowly on its mechanism. Pierce demonstrated the maintenance procedures with military precision, explaining how to trim the wicks and refill the oil. "The light must never go out," he insisted. "Never. No matter what you hear, no matter what you see, keep it burning." That first week passed quietly enough. I learned my duties, settled into the rhythm of 4-hour watches alternating with Pierce. The work wasn't hard, but the isolation was palpable. Our only contact with the outside world was the crackling radio and the weekly supply boat, weather permitting. But as January deepened, strange things began to happen. It started with sounds, footsteps on the gallery, when no one was there, whispers in the wind that seemed to form words. I'd catch movement from the corner of my eye, only to find empty rooms when I turned. Pierce noticed my unease. "You're hearing them too, aren't you?" he asked one evening as we sat in the kitchen. "The voices." I hesitated, not wanting to sound crazy. "I thought it was just the wind." He shook his head slowly. "Morton heard them first. Said they were calling him, begging him to join them." Pierce's hands trembled as he lit his pipe. "There are things out there in the dark, son. Things that hunger. They've always been here, watching, waiting. The light holds them back, you see. That's why it must never go out." I wanted to dismiss it as the ramblings of a man too long alone, but that night on watch, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A fog had rolled in, thick as wool, but far from normal. It moved against the wind, swirling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate. And in that fog, I saw faces. "Your grandmother used to tell me I was crazy when I spoke of this." I told my grandchildren, noting how Marcus and Marie had drawn closer together. But I swear on my life, those faces were real. Dozens of them, forming and dissolving in the mist. Men, women, children, all with expressions of terrible longing, all reaching toward the light. Emily pulled her blanket tighter. "Were they ghosts, grandfather?" I stared into the fire, remembering. "I wish they had been, little one." "Ghosts might have been easier to understand." "No, These were something else entirely. Something older, something hungry. What happened next? Marcus whispered. Ah, I said, my voice growing heavy with memory. That's when the real horror began. You see, the next night, Pierce didn't come up for his watch. And when I went to check on him, I found Pierce's room empty, his bed untouched. The door to the gallery was open, swinging gently in the wind. His logbook lay open on the desk, the last entry a frantically scrawled message. They're getting stronger. The light isn't enough anymore. I called out for him. I told my grandchildren, watching the firelight flicker across their intent faces. My voice echoed through the tower, but only the wind answered. That's when I heard it, a sound I'll never forget. A low, mournful singing, coming from somewhere below the lighthouse. The fog that night was thicker than ever, pressing against the windows like a living thing. As I climbed the tower to maintain the light, the singing grew louder. It was beautiful in a terrible way, like a funeral dirge performed by a choir of the drowned. At the top of the tower, I found Pierce's pipe, still warm, lying on the gallery rail. The fog swirled around it, and in its depths, I saw his face, but changed, somehow. His eyes were darker, wider, like deep sea creatures that had never known light. Come, the fog seemed to whisper. Join us. The water is warm, and we are so lonely. I stumbled back inside, my heart pounding. The radio crackled to life, but instead of the usual weather reports, I heard only that same haunting song, punctuated by voices speaking in languages I'd never heard. The light had to be maintained. Pierce had drilled that into me, never let it go out, no matter what. But as I worked, I felt eyes watching me from the darkness. The fog pressed closer, and faces formed in the glass, hundreds of them now, all with that same hungry look. They were the lost ones, I explained, as Emily clutched her blanket tighter. Every soul the sea had ever claimed along this coast. Ships that went down in storms, children who wandered too close to the cliff edge, swimmers taken by rip tides. All of them gathered there, called by something ancient and terrible that lived in the deep. The night stretched endlessly. I kept the light burning, but its beams seemed weaker, as if the darkness was becoming too thick for even its powerful beam to pierce. The singing never stopped, and now it was joined by another sound, the scrape of wet footsteps on the tower stairs. I barricaded myself in the watch room, but the sounds kept getting closer. Water began seeping under the door, not fresh rain, but seawater, thick with the smell of salt and decay. In its puddles, I saw reflected faces that shouldn't have been there, reaching up as if trying to break through a mirror. Pierce knew, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper. He knew what they were, what they wanted. In his logbook, I found entries going back years, documenting their growing strength. The light had kept them at bay, but they were learning, adapting. They had taken Morton, and now they had Pierce. The temperature in the watch room plummeted. Frost formed on the windows, creating patterns that looked disturbingly like pleading hands. The singing reached a fever pitch, and suddenly, the light began to sputter. I rushed to check the mechanism, but there was nothing mechanically wrong. The darkness itself seemed to be fighting the light, trying to snuff it out, and if it succeeded, I knew there would be nothing to hold back what waited in the fog. What I did next, I told my spellbound grandchildren, was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've ever done. I knew I had to keep that light burning, no matter the cost. So I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Marcus leaned forward. What did you do, grandfather? I stared into the fire, remembering the terrible choice I'd made. I opened the door, I said softly. I stepped out onto that gallery, into the fog where they waited. Because sometimes, children, the only way to face darkness is to walk straight into it. Marie gasped. But the faces in the fog, weren't you afraid? Terrified, I admitted. But I had sworn an oath to keep that light burning, to protect the ships at sea. And sometimes our duty must be stronger than our fear. The fire popped loudly, making Emily jump. Outside, the wind continued to howl, as if echoing the song I'd heard so many years ago. "And what happened when you stepped onto the gallery?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I looked at each of their faces in turn, seeing the same mixture of fear and fascination I'd felt that night. That, my dear grandchildren, is where the true horror began. You see, what waited for me in that fog was far worse than anything I'd imagined. It was— "Would you like me to continue with Chapter 3? I asked, watching their eager nods. The next part reveals what truly lurked in the darkness of Ravens Point Lighthouse. The fog enveloped me the moment I stepped onto the gallery. It was thick and cold, with an oily texture that clung to my skin. The singing surrounded me now, no longer distant but intimate, as if the voices were whispering directly into my ears. "The first thing I saw," I continued, leaning forward in my chair, "was Pierce, or what remained of him. He stood at the gallery's edge, but he wasn't alone. Pale, translucent hands reached up from the fog, dozens of them, caressing his face, his shoulders, pulling gently but persistently. Pierce turned to me, and I saw his transformation was nearly complete. His skin had taken on a greenish tinge, and gills were forming along his neck. His eyes were black pools now, reflecting the lighthouse beam as it swept past. "Join us," he said, but his voice was mixed with others, a chorus of the drowned. "The Queen is waiting. She's waited so long." "The Queen?" Marcus interrupted, his eyes wide. I nodded grimly. "Yes. You see all those faces in the fog, all those lost souls, they were just servants. Below the waves, in the deepest trench off Ravens Point, something ancient dwelled. Something that had been collecting souls since the first ships sailed these waters." The beam of light swept around again, and in its brief illumination, I saw the true horror. The fog wasn't fog at all. It was more like a web, composed of countless translucent forms all linked together. Faces emerged and submerged within it. Hands reached and withdrew, and through it all ran that hypnotic song. But worse was what I saw beyond the web. As the light beam cut through the darkness, it illuminated something massive rising from the waves below. A pale form the size of a ship, with tentacles that stretched up through the fog like pillars of living pearl. "The Queen of the Deep," I whispered to my captivated audience. A creature older than humanity itself, feeding not on flesh but on souls. Every person she took became part of her endless web, drawing in others, growing her power. Pierce was almost to the railing now, his movements jerky as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. The hands from the fog had multiplied, and I could see faces pressing through, the mist around him, Morton's among them, and dozens of others I recognized from photographs of the missing. I knew I had only moments to act. The light was growing dimmer, and if it went out, there would be nothing to hold back the Queen and her web of souls. But to reach the light, I had to cross the gallery where those hungry hands waited. What I did next, I said, watching my grandchildren lean closer, required every ounce of courage I possessed. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the one thing I had brought with me from my old life, a silver pendant blessed by my grandmother, who knew the old ways. The pendant had been warm before, but now it burned in my hand like a star fallen to earth. The nearest reaching hands recoiled from its glow, and the song faltered for just a moment. That moment was all I needed. I lunged forward, pendant raised high, its light creating a small, safe passage through the fog. Pierce turned at my approach, his transformed face twisting in an inhuman snarl. "You don't understand," he gurgled, seawater spilling from his lips. "Her embrace is eternal. No more loneliness, no more fear, only the song forever." But I did understand. I told my grandchildren, my voice heavy with memory. I understood that some prices are too high to pay, some songs too dangerous to hear. The queen didn't offer peace, she offered oblivion. I reached the light just as it began to sputter again. The mechanism was ice, cold to the touch, covered in a layer of frost that shouldn't have been possible. Below, the massive pale form was rising higher, and I could feel her attention turning toward me. Then I saw them, my parents, lost at sea when I was young, their faces forming in the fog. They reached for me, smiling, promising an end to the grief I'd carried all these years. Come. They whispered in voices that were both theirs and not theirs. We've missed you so. Emily clutched her brother's hand. Did you go to them? I shook my head slowly. No, dear one. Because at that moment, I remembered something my grandmother told me, the dead may return. But what comes back isn't always what left. I knew these weren't really my parents, they were lures, created by something that had never known human love. The pendant's light was fading, and the fog pressed closer. Pierce was halfway over the railing now, and the song had reached a maddening crescendo. I had seconds to act, to make a choice that would determine not just my fate, but the fate of every soul that might pass this lighthouse in the future. And so, I said, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls, I did the only thing I could. I raised my grandmother's pendant high, spoke the words she had taught me long ago, and confronted the Queen of the Deep herself. Marie's eyes were like saucers. What happened then? Grandfather. I looked into the fire, remembering the terror and triumph of that moment. That, my dear ones, is where the true battle began. For you see, the Queen had ruled these waters for centuries, but she had never faced someone who knew her true name. The ancient words my grandmother taught me rolled off my tongue like thunder. Each syllable made the fog recoil, creating ripples in the supernatural web that surrounded the lighthouse. The Queen's massive form shuddered, her pearlescent tentacles twisting in what might have been recognition or fear. Names have power, I told my grandchildren, my voice dropping to match the gravity of the memory. The oldest creatures, the ones that existed before time itself, they all have true names. Names that bind them, that reveal their nature. My grandmother was keeper of such knowledge, passed down through generations. The pendant blazed brighter with each word I spoke, its light no longer silver, but gold, then white, hot. The faces in the fog began to dissolve, their expressions changing from seductive to desperate. Pierce hung suspended between the gallery and the void, caught between transformation and salvation. En yarotip bnhthe wovius, I roared into the storm.
I no and bndio.
The response was immediate and terrible. The song transformed into a shriek that shattered every window in the lighthouse. The fog web convulsed, and souls began breaking free, their forms ascending like sparks from a fire. The Queen's tentacles whipped through the air, trying to snatch them back. But naming her wasn't enough. I continued, watching my grandchildren's rapt faces. Power like hers, built over centuries of collecting souls, couldn't be broken by words alone. She had to be given something in exchange. That's how the old magic works. A bargain had to be struck. Pierce's body jerked violently as the Queen's influence warred with the power of her true name. I could see the humanity returning to his eyes, fighting against the darkness that had nearly claimed him. But the transformation had gone too far. Without intervention, he would die caught between two worlds. The Queen knew this too. Her voice filled my mind, no longer singing but speaking in thoughts ancient and cold as the deep ocean. Trade then, lighthouse keeper. What will you offer for these paltry souls? What can equal centuries of my collection? That's when I understood what my grandmother's pendant really was. I said, touching my chest where it had once rested. It wasn't just blessed silver. It was a vessel, containing something the Queen had lost long ago, when she first retreated to the depths. The pendant grew so hot it nearly burned through my palm. Inside its silver confines, something stirred, a light older than the one that crowned the lighthouse, a fragment of the sun that had once driven the queen into the darkness. Marie gasped. You had a piece of the sun. In a way, I nodded. More accurately, I had a piece of memory, the memory of warmth, of light, of life above the waves. The queen had been so long in the dark, she'd forgotten what she once was. The pendant held that remembrance. I held the pendant out over the railing, above the queen's writhing form. I offer you memory, I declared. The memory of what you were before the dark claimed you. Take it, and release those you've bound. The tentacles froze in their violent dance. The shrieking stopped. In the sudden silence, I could feel her consideration and her fear. To remember what she had been might destroy what she had become. The choice is yours, I told the ancient being. But choose quickly. The sun rises soon, and with it, this chance passes forever. For a moment that felt like eternity, nothing moved. Then, slowly, one pearlescent tentacle rose toward the pendant. As it touched the silver surface, the metal dissolved, and the light within poured out like liquid gold. The effect was catastrophic and beautiful. The queen's form illuminated from within, her pale bulk becoming translucent, then radiant. The souls in her web broke free in a cascade of light, each one rising toward the pre-dawn sky. Pierce's body jerked once more, then collapsed onto the gallery as his transformation reversed. The queen's scream in that moment, I said softly, wasn't one of pain or rage, but of remembrance. She remembered swimming in sun-warmed waters, remembered the joy of light playing on waves. She remembered what it was to be part of the living world, not its eternal enemy. As the sun's first rays touched the horizon, the queen began to sink back into the depths. But she was changed, her form no longer pale and sickly, but shot through with colors like mother of pearl. The fog dissipated, revealing a sea turned golden by dawn. I found Pierce unconscious but alive, I concluded. When he woke, he remembered everything, though he rarely spoke of it. The queen never returned to Raven's Point, though sometimes, on quiet nights, sailors report hearing a distant song, not mournful now, but filled with an ancient joy. Marcus leaned forward. But grandfather, what happened to all the souls she took? Did they find peace? I smiled gently. Look there. I pointed to the fire, where sparks rose toward the chimney. Like those sparks rising, they returned to the light they came from. And on some nights, if you watch the stars over the sea, you might see them dancing. Emily frowned thoughtfully. And the pendant? Was it destroyed? The silver? Yes, I nodded. But its purpose was fulfilled. Some things exist only to remind us of what we've forgotten, to light the way back to what we once were. The fire crackled softly, and outside, the wind had calmed to a gentle whisper. My grandchildren sat quietly, absorbing the story's weight. But there was one more thing they needed to know, one final truth to share. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the weight of years and memories. My grandchildren waited, sensing there was more to the tale. The firelight cast long shadows across the study's walls, reminiscent of that fateful night at the lighthouse. There's something I haven't told you, I said quietly. Something about why I'm sharing this story now, after keeping it secret for so many years. I rolled up my sleeve slowly, revealing what looked like a birthmark on my forearm. But in the firelight, it shifted and moved like waves beneath my skin, with a faint pearlescent sheen. The queen's touch left a mark on all who encountered her. I explained. Pierce bore his until the day he died last spring, and I've carried mine for 60 years. But unlike his, mine came with a purpose and a promise. Emily reached out hesitantly, then drew back. Does it hurt? I shook my head, smiling. No. Dear one, it's a reminder, not a wound. You see, when the queen accepted my offer that night, when she reclaimed her memories of the light, she understood something profound. There must always be those who remember, those who stand between the light and dark. Like lighthouse keepers, Marcus whispered. Exactly. But not just of physical lights, I continued. Keepers of memories, of stories, of truths that the world tries to forget. The Queen knew that one day she would need to pass on what she had learned about the importance of remembering who we truly are. I looked at each of my grandchildren in turn. That's why I've gathered you here tonight. The mark is fading, you see, and when it disappears completely, you'll join the light. Emily finished, her eyes wide with understanding. Yes, but before that happens, I needed to pass on this story and something more. I reached into my desk drawer and withdrew 2 small silver pendants, identical to the one I had used that night. Your grandmother didn't just leave me 1 pendant. She left 3, knowing this day would come. Each contains not just blessed silver, but a fragment of memory different from what the Queen received, but no less powerful. I held them out, 1 to each grandchild. These are your inheritance. Not just jewelry, but responsibility. The world is changing, becoming more rational, more dismissive of the old truths. But the deep places remain, and what dwells in them hasn't disappeared just because we've stopped believing. The pendants caught the firelight, sending strange reflections dancing across the walls. You don't have to accept them, I added softly. The path of a keeper isn't an easy one, but if you do, well, remember, Marcus said firmly, taking one of the pendants. We'll keep the stories alive. Emily took the other, her small fingers closing around it with determination. And we'll watch the deep places. I felt a warmth in my chest that had nothing to do with the fire. There's one more thing you should know. The Queen's song, it didn't just stop. It changed. Sometimes, on nights when the moon is full and the tide is high, you might hear it. Not calling people to the depths anymore, but reminding them of the light they carry within. Standing slowly, I walked to the window. The moon was rising over the sea, casting a silver path across the waves. Listen, I whispered. And there it was, faint but clear, a melody that spoke of sunlit waters and ancient joy, of remembrance and return. My grandchildren joined me at the window, their new pendants gleaming. The mark will fade by morning, I told them. But what I've given you will last as long as you choose to carry it. Remember this night, remember the story, and most importantly, remember that even the darkest depths can't extinguish the light we carry, they can only help us appreciate it more. Emily slipped her small hand into mine. Will we see you again, grandfather? I squeezed her hand gently. In every lighthouse beam that cuts through fog. In every story you tell of the deep places. In every moment you stand between light and dark, remembering what others have forgotten. The mark on my arm was barely visible now, its pearlescent sheen fading like morning mist. But I felt no fear, only a deep sense of completion. The cycle would continue. The stories would live on. The light would keep shining. Look, Marcus pointed out to sea. Where the moonlight touched the waves, something moved, something vast and graceful. Its form shot through with colors like mother of pearl. A song rose from the depths, no longer lonely, no longer hungry, but full of ancient wisdom and remembered joy. The Queen had kept her part of the bargain. Now it was time for me to keep mine. Tell the stories, I whispered to my grandchildren. Keep the lights burning. And remember, always remember, that what dwells below isn't just darkness. Sometimes it's memory, waiting to be reclaimed. Sometimes it's truth, waiting to surface. And sometimes, I smiled as the mark finally faded completely, leaving only untouched skin behind. Sometimes it's light, remembering what it used to be. The fire crackled one final time, and the song from the sea reached its crescendo. My grandchildren stood at the window, their pendants glowing softly, ready to begin their own stories as keepers of the light. And somewhere between the depths and the stars, between memory and myth, between what was and what would be, a lighthouse keeper's final tale came to an end, and a new one began.